astrology, but our understanding of history as well. So, I was really blown away by your research and the details. So I'll put all of Rosie's details of her website, her book that we're going to be talking about, her research, etc., underneath this video, so you can pursue all of that further. But just welcome, Rosie. It's lovely to have you on.
Yes, thank you, Pam. It's lovely to be here and to connect with you and just to have a conversation with you and to be here with your audience too. Thank you.
Wonderful. And just to let everybody know, this is a slightly more technical subject, but don't let that scare you, because Rosie and I will make every effort to translate it back to English, because I know we have a broad spectrum of understanding out there with the viewership. But hang on till the end, because it's good news. And it's good news in quite a surprising way. So I'm not going to spoil the ending, but it's well worth listening to the end. So Rosie, shall we start with declination? Because I don't think that's a very familiar term to many people who've got some understanding of astrology.
Yeah, so declination is when you take the equatorial plane, which is the equator of the Earth, you extend it out into space, and then you measure the degrees that a planet moves above that plane or below that plane. So there's declination to the north, there's declination to the south. And a lot of astrologers use parallel contraparallels, and that has to do with when the declination of two planets are at the same point.
Yeah.
Or opposite points is contraparallel.
And it goes up to 23.5 north and 23.5 degrees south. And if you imagine it like a kind of double band with a celestial equator in the middle, it's like a double band, and within that double band, normally planets will orbit. But occasionally, depending on the planet, its orbit, its duration, its frequency, they will kind of go rogue. They will break beyond the 23 degrees north or south of that celestial equator. And I find this, I often talk about this, Rosie, because I find it so interesting. I've often, in videos, mentioned out of bounds Mars, because that certainly has manifestation in the world. But if we're looking at this as individuals, often if you have an out of bounds planet natally, say at 24, 25, 26 degrees north or south, you are highly individualistic, and there's an intensity that comes in, and often make a significant contribution to the world. I mean, if you have out of bounds Mercury, I think Einstein had out of bounds Mercury. I know that. I know that he did a bulk of his work in 1905 when Mercury was out of bounds. Okay, fantastic. And Louis Pasteur natally had Uranus out of bounds, so that can bring in a kind of genius quality. Athletes often have Mars out of bounds, and if you think of it almost both astronomically and behaviorally as going beyond the normal bounds, I think that's quite a helpful way to look at it. But here we're going to be talking about Pluto.
Yes. Yeah, so when a planet goes out of bounds, it's unleashed. It does its wildest, craziest stuff, right? So I started studying about out of bounds when I was working with Dr. Mitchell Gibson, who was talking about mystical quotient. He was talking about Mercury out of bounds mostly. But when I started looking at Pluto out of bounds, which is a planet of transformation and profound change and evolution, I started noticing a cycle in history, because Pluto, when it goes out of bounds, will go out of bounds for a couple of decades, twice in its 248-year cycle. So we can delineate time periods with Pluto, whereas with Mercury it's so fast and Venus it's so fast, right?
Right, and it's interesting, I'm aware that Saturn never goes out of bounds. I think that's correct. It's because it's a planet that's to do with boundaries. Is that correct, Rosie?
Well, I understand that Jupiter and Saturn don't go out of bounds because their orbits are so perfectly inside the orbital plane. Right. So when a planet's orbit, like Pluto's inclined at 17 degrees, Mercury's quite a bit inclined. So the planets that have a little bit of inclination, they have to have that in order to go out of bounds.
Right. And you can find this yourself for your own personal chart if you go onto astro.com, I think, Rosie. And I think you have to go into the extended version and you can find whether you natally have any planets out of bounds or within your own software program. Solar Fire certainly provides that in the report section. So it's very...
Yeah, if you look at the declination, yeah.
So tell us about your insight, how that happened, because it's really fascinating what you discovered about Pluto's declination and what happens historically when it goes out of bounds. Because your research goes back, I think, about 3,000 years, doesn't it? It's extraordinary.
Yeah, well, first of all, I started looking at Pluto out of bounds just to see what it was like. And because I didn't know much history, I was pretty blown away because the events that I was seeing when Pluto were out of bounds were things that I recognized, like World War II, Genghis Khan, Augustus Caesar. These were names that I knew. So then over the 20 years, what took me so long was really wanting to make sure that in every single cycle, as far back as I could go, which was about 1800 BC, that I could see this pattern. And one of the delineations that showed up was that Pluto out of bounds to the north and Pluto out of bounds to the south are quite different in the experiences that happen on the planet.
I'd love you to talk about this. Do you want to start with Pluto out of bounds to the north? And if you need to show us any charts as you go through, Rosie, that you feel are appropriate, please do.
Okay. So when Pluto goes out of bounds to the north, this is the time of empire building. This is the time when dictators or tyrants take over and they expand their empires. The difference between that and Pluto out of bounds to the south is that this out of bounds to the south is more reformations, revolutions, and collapse. So in the prior cycle, or actually in this cycle, Pluto out of bounds went out of bounds to the north in the 1940s. So around 1938 until about 1952. And in that time period, we had World War II. And Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, all the names that we typically associate with dictators and tyrants. And if we go back to the prior cycle, and would you like me to show the slides?
Yes, because I think the peak of the last cycle you said was around about 1945.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard
1944 and 1945.
And I've heard you say that it began on Kristallnacht, which was a, horrific episode in Nazi history as well.
Yes.
And I think Hitler had Pluto out of bounds. Is that correct, Rosie?
I'm sorry, say that again?
I understand that Hitler had an out of bounds planet. I think Pluto, is that correct?
He would not have had Pluto out of bounds in his natal chart.
Okay.
Because he was probably born closer to when Pluto was at 0 degrees declination.
Okay, yeah.
So Pluto went out of bounds at this particular window of time. And yeah, 1938. In fact, if you track Pluto out of bounds, it went in and out of bounds just a little bit at the beginning of that time period. And it was in bounds during the Anschluss, which was when Nazi Germany moved into Austria without any resistance. But then as soon as Pluto went out of bounds, that is when Germany invaded Poland, and that's really what a lot of historians consider as the beginning of World War II.
Yeah.
So we see, even just in the minuteness of Pluto exactly moving out of bounds, we see this kind of eruption of power, and I think fear that goes along with it. So at 1945, 1944, the summer was when Pluto was peaking out of bounds, which was the time period of the Bretton Woods Convention, and when the leaders were figuring out how they were going to move forward after World War II, particularly financially. And then 1945 in the summer, during the atomic bombs, when those were dropped, that was also Pluto at its peak of out of bounds.
It's hard to imagine the fear, isn't it, at a time like that? That must have been absolutely extreme.
I think that's something to really recognize, that there are times, if Pluto's out of bounds, I correlate it in my book to the abduction of Persephone. It's like we're taken unawares in a way. And there's a sense, even if we go back to the prior cycle before this one, we think about Peter the Great and William and Mary and Louis XIV, that there's this bowing that appears, like when we look at it from a historical perspective, like, why didn't anybody rise up at that time period? But historically, those are time periods when people don't rise up, when there's a sense of being unprepared or unaware of what's happening until it's too late.
So there's a sense of extreme domination of power, abuse of power.
Yes.
Very strong top-down power in those regimes where Pluto goes out of bounds to the north. And that seems to be a very clear and distinct theme in all the work you've done.
Yeah, I'm going to go back 2 cycles because this one so perfectly aligns. When Pluto went out of bounds, almost to the month, during this window of time period in the 1200s, Genghis Khan's wife was abducted. And it was the beginning of his campaign against the villagers. And at the peak of Pluto out of bounds is when he was crowned Genghis Khan. So there's a lot of times at the peak of Pluto out of bounds when there's an emperor that's crowned. Augustus Caesar was crowned at that time period. We have Tiglath-Pileser and Darius the Great, and lots of conquerors that maybe a lot of us haven't heard of, but that, if you look historically, have been really significant in terms of conquering and taking over lands, countries, cultures.
And this has been a very consistent pattern, hasn't it, all the way back? Because you've gone way back, before Christ, and this has been very consistent.
Yes, every single time. Even in the time periods that I didn't know anything about, when I looked and I saw that, okay, when you actually read the historical texts, they talk about this conqueror or that person, and how much power they amassed in the world at that time. Yeah. One of the cycles that I think is important to be considering, that really lines up with what's going on right now, is the time period of the Roman Empire. So a little bit equating the US Empire to the Roman Empire in terms of what happened in the cycle. During Pluto out of bounds, exactly when Pluto went out of bounds, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, which was his beginning the war with Pompey and beginning the unsettling of the Roman Republic, which had been formed as almost a democracy up until that point in time. And when Pluto was at the peak of out of bounds, we had Augustus Caesar, who expanded the empire and pushed the boundaries of the empire quite extensively. As soon as Pluto went left out of bounds, which correlates to our current cycle, 1952, that's when he stopped his expansion and started focusing a little more on infrastructure.
Really interesting. So the themes that come through with Pluto out of bounds to the north are very clearly empire, domination, abuse of power, very often inequality in society, rich, powerful people at the top, very poor people at the bottom being told what to do, and a lot of war and fear and death as part of that whole picture as well.
Yes.
So super clear. Okay, so can you share with us about the characteristics of Pluto out of bounds to the south, Rosie? Because that's a much rosier picture.
So let's go back to this current cycle.
Yeah.
So first of all, Pluto is starting its journey out of bounds to the south in September of 2025, so September of this year. And it will be on and off, in and out of bounds over the next 10 years. And in the past, when Pluto's gone out of bounds to the south, there's been revolutions, reformations, there's been a rise up, and people get more power. People rise up, they respond, they're ready for the takeover in a way, and they, in some ways, either mitigate it. Sometimes there are leaders that step in that realize they can't continue expanding the empire. They have to focus on more rights to the people. They have to restructure their governments or restructure what's happening inside the culture. So every single time, it's been people rising. And it's not always easy or peaceful or harmonious, but it always happens. And it always happens in some form. Now, sometimes the empires completely collapse and fall apart, and that's part of what happens. So in my book, I outline 5 different potential futures as they've happened in the past. Collapse, revolution, a paradigm shift scientifically often happens, and benevolent rulers, demonstrations that lead to that. And then also, I'm thinking that because history doesn't always repeat, that there's an evolutionary process, and certainly this cycle has a lot of significant differences to other cycles, including the technology that's developed, the mass population that's developed, that we might see a global awakening during the time period.
Yeah, and I'd love to come to that in a little while, because that's really exciting. I mean, I think I just love the way your research is backing up so many different points of view, modalities, experts talking about, it's just amazing. So, but just to backtrack a little bit, what I found fascinating in your research as well is there's a very high correlation between when Pluto goes out of bounds to the south, that's power shifting to the people, the collapse of empires, etc., more democracy coming in, and when Pluto is in Aquarius. For instance, the last time it was out of bounds to the south was in 1775 to 1796. Well, Pluto, as we know, was in Aquarius from 1777 to 1798. So it's almost identical. And then even before the previous cycle, I think Pluto was in Aquarius from 1524 to 1553. And of course, during that time in 1534, Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church. So because he wanted to divorce one wife and marry another, and the Catholic Church didn't allow divorce. So there was a weakening of that top-down system. And so I think broadly you found there's a correlation. It isn't exact because it includes Capricorn as well a little bit, but there's quite a high correlation, Rosie, yes, with Aquarius and Pluto out of bounds south, which fits with mythology, doesn't it? Aquarius, power to the people, freedom, humanitarianism, greater egalitarianism.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the pieces is that Pluto has been going out of bounds because our tilt is changing. Pluto's been going out of bounds for shorter and shorter periods of time. So even back in the time period you're talking about when King Henry VIII, that Pluto was out of bounds for 20 years because it was out of bounds for longer. It was out of bounds to a greater extent. So, and then if you keep going back farther and farther, then it extends into Capricorn. So it's definitely correlating with the time period of Pluto in Aquarius, and then Pluto in Leo, which is about leadership and power, which is out of bounds to the north. One of the reasons I don't lean into that much in the book is because I wanted to keep it really simple. I think there's been a lot of conversation in the past, particularly 20 years ago when I was starting to do this, around the difference between the sidereal and the tropical zodiacs, which gets people all kind of looped up. And I wanted to just keep it that, this is precise historical research based on this one astronomical cycle. But yes, of course, Aquarius is about that awakening and rising up and collaboration and people getting together.
Amazing. And Rosie, because you've looked at such huge cycles of time here with this study, have you found any correlation to the Yuga cycles at all?
I haven't. I'm going to.
Okay.
I've studied the Yuga cycles. I know that there's some new research out there. I haven't delved into it yet. I think in my experience, there's not been a lot of agreement about when the Yugas have happened. But I do believe we're in the Kali Yuga and moving out of it. But
yeah. Because this is Bibhu Dev Misra's huge scholarly work, and he's basically been saying March 21st this year, just gone, we began to move out of Kali Yuga. So in a sense, it's reinforcing some of what you're seeing going forwards. But then on top of all of this, these amazing insights and all the massive historical analysis you've done, you've also identified what you call 4 different phases as we go through Pluto's cycle. So could you share those with us?
Yes. So can I do one thing before that?
Yeah.
I want to share, because I was hinting at this, that Pluto has been going out of bounds for shorter and shorter time periods. And this is part of my hope and also my amazement that it would change so quickly, actually. But one of the reasons I think this next time period is so significant is it's the last time that Pluto goes out of bounds. So in the next cycle, the next time Pluto goes into Leo, it won't be out of bounds. So we might see a much more measured, we might even see a really different society developing as we maybe move into alignment with a deeper understanding of Pluto and our evolution and our ability to process and digest life's experiences. Okay, so then I also started looking at when Pluto crossed the equatorial plane, so that's 0 degrees declination. And I noticed that there was a cycle of this that began, or at least it could begin anywhere, but I was noticing that starting with Pluto as it's at 0 degrees declination, moving from south to north, that it was a time period of a lot of visionaries. And those visionaries really set the stage for how the rest of the cycle would unfold. And then I called Pluto, when it's out of bounds to the north, the power time. And then when Pluto goes at 0 degrees declination, moving from north to south, then I call this the justice time period. It's really when people start crying for justice. They start asking for justice. It's when the martyrs and the peoples step out and say, look, the emperor has no clothes. Look, something's wrong. Something's corrupt here. And then I called the time period that we're moving into, Pluto out of bounds, I call that reform. So then as we're looking at our current cycle, we can look at the visionaries to see what sets the stage for what unfolds throughout the rest of the cycle. I think one of the more extraordinary things, so in our current cycle was the 1860s, particularly 1860 to 1865. And when we look at the science that was happening at that time period, particularly James Clerk Maxwell's equations, which set the stage for all of the technology that we have currently, including, Einstein's work. Everything has been connected to our equations of electricity and magnetism that he developed. It's also a time period of Darwin. It's also when Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital. So we have lots of visionaries at this time period bringing in radically new ideas. And when we get to the Pluto out of bounds, it was also the beginning of computers and Alan Turing and that work that was done. And when we get to the 1980s, which was when Pluto crossed 0 degrees declination, the Justice time period, that was a time, we had a lot of uprisings, particularly in the US, civil rights movements. And I'm saying that just because I'm more familiar with the US history. But in the 1980s, there was a lot of underground movements that started. And we had kind of a time period when I think we're tracking a lot of the corruption that we're seeing, at least in the US right now, connected to things that really started in the 1980s. And a lot of that was happening in reaction to World War II. Like there was a sense of people starting to see that we had to change, and there's a lot of activism that was happening in the 1980s.
Absolutely.
And a lot of times the activism that happens at that justice point are people who some people listen to, but not enough people listen to. So they often are killed or destroyed, like we see Ed Snowden and Julian Assange, like just how punished they are for coming out and speaking out. And that pretty much happens also in every cycle.
I also, Rosie, I loved some of the visionaries you were quoting in an earlier cycle. Aristotle, Ptolemy, Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, almost all of them were astronomers and astrologers. And they were leaders of their time. And, we still, their household names even today.
Yes.
They really were massive visionaries. And so much, Ptolemy, I'm still using his rules as my bread and butter every day. He had astonishing insight, most astrologers are. So, the power of what you've seen in this 4 phases of this cycle, I think is quite brilliant, actually. And when you talk about the 1860s and James Clerk Maxwell and all of his calculations about electricity and magnetism, that is so interesting, isn't it? Because we've gone down the road of electricity and electricity meters and paying our bills, etc. But magnetism, as I understand, which I think is where the future lies, is free power, because it comes from the earth, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And there's been brilliant work being done around this. I think oftentimes the visionary, their work gets a little bit co-opted by the powerful elites. In the beginning, we saw that with Aristotle, right? He trained Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great used that knowledge to enhance his ability to conquer. We see that with Cicero, where he taught Julius Caesar. We see that with a lot of those visionaries, because maybe perhaps in past cycles, in particular, that education and that level of education is so elite. But then when we get to the reform time, which is what we're heading into, like everybody started understanding the work of Aristotle. Everyone started understanding the work of Galileo and even Petrarch, I want to say, but yeah.
So it's so interesting that repeating cycle of the four phases of the vision, and then the power, and then the justice, and then the reform, and that's been again very reliable in your research, hasn't it?
Yes, I mean, if we go back to just the prior cycle. The beginning was the early 1600s, 1610, 1619, in that time period. So that was Galileo, Kepler. It was also the beginning of colonization, the beginning of the East India Trading Company, the beginning of really that corporate capitalistic model. When we get to the power time period, really massive colonization was happening through the trading companies, the European trading companies that were sort of, I want to say, fiscally invading much of the world at that time. And so the scientists are beginning at this time period in this whole scientific model, Francis Bacon. And when we get up here at the north, we have the London Society, we have Newton and Boyle, and them taking the work of Kepler and Galileo and using it for invention, for powerful inventions. And then at the Reform time, we really have the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where the inventions, which steam engine, they were kind of crude inventions at the power time up here, they were refined into things that could be very usable, spinning jenny, when we get down to this Reform time period. So we see kind of the ability to adapt and take the ideas that the visionary has. And first, they're in the power elites, which Newton and Boyle and Locke, they were all part of that rich society that was happening in London at the time. And then it being a movement for the people when we get down to the revolutions of the colonies and the French Revolution. And I think there were a lot of revolutions happening at that Reform time in the prior cycle.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So coming to this current cycle, the last Pluto out of bounds to the north was 1938 to 1952, you said, Rosie. Mm-hmm. So Can you take us through where we are now? Because this starts to get very exciting, I think.
So when we think about this cycle, when we think about the visionaries, there's visionaries that we're looking at that are bringing on the corruption and the difficulties we're having, like the 1860s were really the beginning of the robber barons and the beginning of this mass accumulation of wealth that started in the United States right during that Civil War time. And then at the power time period, there were all these agreements about how to divide the world up that were made by the Allies, that were separating out Vietnam and Korea and the Berlin Wall. And we saw this creation of a divisiveness at the power time period. And when we got to the justice time period, it was the fall of the Soviet Union. It was that kind of separation out. There were very peaceful demonstrations that happened at that time period, particularly in Eastern Europe, that were creating a big transformation. And I think that people in Eastern Europe and in Yugoslavia and places where they experienced so much change during the justice time period are a little more, I would say, emotionally prepared for what's coming, because what's coming is a profound shift in terms of how we delineate the boundaries between countries, between states, between economic systems. So that in the 1980s, we can look to that time period to even kind of dive into what countries were doing. And we can look at what even China at that time period, they were violently suppressing the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. And in a way, they seem to be taking that information, and instead of trying to continue to create more power that like the US did, it started investing a little bit more and more into the people. And into infrastructure in their country, which was a little more foresight than I think what we're seeing, at least in the US. And I think it's also really extraordinary when we look at Europe through this cycle. We have the beginning of it, which most of these main visionaries were living in Europe. And we have such massive destruction during World War II. And then the beginning of the EU begins at the Justice time period. And thinking about these vastly different cultures who've been at war for centuries and centuries coming together to create some agreements together. And I know it hasn't been easy and it hasn't always been smooth, and Brexit, but I think when Pluto goes out of bounds, there's really an opportunity for extraordinary change. And looking at our ability to have conversations that bridge East, West, different cultures, and the different places like in Europe that have done the work to bridge different cultures are setting the stage for us to perhaps even have a peaceful and profound revolution.
Yeah. And what you have discovered also about this particular period that we're entering, this out of bounds to the south, because previously, as you said, it could have been a 20-year cycle, but Pluto was out of bounds the entire 20 years, that the entire time. But we're now moving into a different phase where it is literally going to be just a few months of each year for the next 10 years. I think it starts September the 11th this year into November. Can you take us through that? Because that's to do with the shifting plane of the orbits as well, that you might explain to us.
Yes. So even to go back to Pluto out of bounds to the north, it wasn't out of bounds to the north for the entire time period, 1938 to 1952, but it was out of bounds to the north continuously throughout the peak of World War II, 1940 to 1947.
Oh.
So we could even go back there. So here are the dates for when Pluto is out of bounds. And I think because it doesn't last an entire year, I think it gives us a chance to experience the Pluto out of bounds when it's mostly August to December, and then recuperate, restructure, relook at how we want to organize things, how we want to move forward. It's much more of a pulsating experience during this time period, which I think also can lend itself to an awakening, just that ability to have contractions into birth instead of just kind of that intensity full on the whole time period.
Yeah, so it's a sense of giving us integration time, if you
Yes.
But what I love about your research is, and this is kind of part of the big news, is that you've discovered this is the last time that Pluto will be going out of bounds for thousands of years. Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's just, this scale is negative, means BC, and this is declination, and this green line is 23.5 degrees. And when we come to this, now the reason this is changing isn't because Pluto's cycle is not changing, but because our tilt is changing. Our tilt is at 23.5 degrees. That's why that 23.5 degrees is so significant. So because our tilt is changing, and this connects to the precession of the equinoxes, the ages, our relationship to how we perceive all the rest of the planets, that is what's changing. Our perception, our way of seeing the sky. And so that is why Pluto is not going out of bounds again after 2035. It will eventually come back because it's a 26,000-year cycle, but that will be thousands of years from now.
Wow, so that suggests a real settling from these swings, these big swings we've had in history, and perhaps a more peaceful coming together of many peoples. Do you think, Rosie?
I do. I think that because some of the visionaries, when we look at the work of Tolstoy, we look at the work of Ramakrishna, there were some really deep spiritual and peaceful activists that were beginning this cycle. Unlike when we look at past cycles, that I think there was just some extraordinary visionaries that were really beginning. We have Madame Blavatsky, who's a great astrologer, that we have the bridging of East-West, and Gandhi was inspired by Ramakrishna, so the ability to peacefully demonstrate and the ability to also heal our trauma, so healing the fields of psychology and sociology. We're beginning naturopathy, homeopathy. These fields were all beginning in the beginning of this cycle. And I think our understanding of ourselves, our even the book Self-Help Itself was written in the 1860s. We have also Henry Dunant and his work around building the International Red Cross and the Geneva Conventions. I mean, nothing like the Geneva Conventions had ever happened before. And he was writing this in response to the Italian Civil War, like seeing that basically war was horrific and we had to create some agreements around it. And oftentimes in the cycle, right before Pluto goes out of bounds, there's quite a bit of unrest. There's an unsettling that happens. And this is what we're in right now. And it maybe it's because we need it to push us into the change that we need to make. But there's that feeling of restlessness. And I think that's why that Roman Empire time period is so interesting, because during that justice time period was a time period of Jesus, and other, I think, teachers were really talking about, look, the Roman Empire is corrupt. Look at what's happening here. And then when we got to the reform time of that time period, there was Boudica and the Jewish revolts, and the Roman Empire almost fell apart. It had 4 emperors, and then it moved into the generals taking over and seeing not just let's go to war, but let's rebuild our infrastructure. So I think that this time period that we're heading into, if we look at the visionaries, we look at who's been crying out for justice, and even the magnitude of World War II, unlike anything that had ever happened, this is going to be a response to that. It's going to be a response to the agreements that were created at that time period that could be completely changed, taken down. One of the things in the prior cycle that happened was that right in the reform time period, there was famine and drought in India, which then put the East India Trading Company into bankruptcy. And when that went into bankruptcy, the British Empire decided they were too big to fail. And it was really that lent itself to the revolutions and the American Revolution that started taking apart the colonies, or taking apart kind of the divorce, we'll say.
Well, it's incredibly good news that we're not going to have another Pluto out of bounds to the north. That is incredibly good news. And, could we even see the end of plutocracy? Isn't it interesting? It's called plutocracy as well. Fascinating. So looking forwards, you have drawn up 5 possible futures, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about those and how you see those unfolding, because this is imminent, isn't it? Pluto's going out of bounds to the south this September and doing it in short bursts, essentially August to December for the next 10 years. And just a question, Rosie, is there a tight correlation between specific dates when Pluto is out of bounds and the social manifestations of the themes that you've identified? Or is it broader than that? Is that too tough in terms of the tight correlation to time? Am I being clear in my question?
I don't think I understand quite the social manifestation.
Okay, so if we're talking about, revolution and rebellion, as we go into September to November, would you expect to see more revolution just over those months this year? Or do you see, because Pluto's in Aquarius, that it will be more widespread than that? Because Pluto, as we know, will stay in Aquarius till 2044 continuously now. So Is it going to
Oh,
be?
yeah, no, I think it's going to be continuous. I mean, I don't think it's, I mean, I think we get a bit of a breather, but I don't think in those time periods we go back to normal in any way.
Right.
Um, I think once it starts, it starts.
Wow.
And when you asked the question, I just started thinking about the Reformation and thinking that, Martin Luther, they were talking about it prior to Pluto going out of bounds. But once Pluto went out of bounds, that's when there were mass demonstrations and mass uprisings in Northern Europe. And then that led to that splitting. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
And the Reformation. Yeah.
So interesting. So tell us about the 5 possible futures that you think could come up over these next 10 years, because they're really interesting in themselves.
All right. Well, the first one, the most difficult one, is collapse. And this, the cycle that I particularly honed in on with this one is back in the end of the Bronze Age, so back 1177 BC, when there were world empires at the time period that had developed, particularly during the power time period with the Egyptians and the Hittites and the Assyrian. These were massive empires with a lot of trade agreements. Eric Klein wrote a great book about 1177 BC, where he goes into the collapse. And I think that in a short period of time, within a 10-year window of time, there was just, it went from these massive trading empires to small local tribal states. And so I think we might see a splintering. I think particularly since the US has been the major superpower throughout this particular cycle, or particularly since World War II, that we may see a splintering among the states. I think that's already, brewing.
They're more decentralization.
But
More decentralization, taking power from the federal government, and that would fit with Pluto and Aquarius as well. Yeah.
yes. Yeah. So, and economic collapse. So that's one. Another one is revolution, like we saw with the French and American Revolution. We've seen revolutions in past cycles that were put down, but then serve to inform the leaders that they couldn't keep doing what they were doing. Like we see that with Vespasian during the Roman Empire. We see that with Justinian during the Byzantine Empire time period. There was a lot of unrest. And then Justinian, he took the information that he was getting from the unrest and he created a code of law, which I think is still referenced today. So I think that revolution, that there could be places where it's violent. We are not a peaceful, unified people at this point in time, but it could be more like spotty, just in little places here and there where we'll see those kind of violent uprisings. And then I think a reformation where there's big demonstrations and peaceful demonstrations that push people into more collaborative leadership. I'm not expecting to see big leaders rise up because I think this is the last time. I think we're going to see much more group work, much more, or even spontaneously people having the same idea all at the same time period. So you can't attribute it to one person. You're just seeing this synchronicity that is happening.
I really agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. Just pulling it out of the collective consciousness, as it were, and people getting very excited to work on their team because it's a great moment. Yeah, I see that very much. Wow. And then the next one is scientific paradigm shift.
Yes, and paradigm shift. So this is when the paradigm that's currently here, which is still gravity, atoms, it starts to break down enough that we have to come up with some new ideas and see things from a different perspective. And so I think this could be radical breakthroughs scientifically. And like you were saying, magnetism, understanding light differently, understanding power differently, being able, and these inventions, I think people have been working on for a long time. Maybe, even before Tesla, maybe, but there's a sense that they've been underground. And I think we will see, even in terms of where there's decentralized power, it can enable people to have the freedom to not have to adhere to certain structures that limit their creativity and possibility.
Yeah, I would really agree.
And I also think as the need arises, then there's more room for these inventions, free energy devices.
I think they're happening in fact, yesterday I saw something on social media where some Australian engineers have built a motor that runs on light. So, free energy was actually invented quite some time ago and then kind of disappeared, but it can easily reappear, I think, because I think a lot of people know how to do that, and that would radically change society. Because I do think the power grids, and I was just saying this in a video I put out this morning, I do think the power grids are going to be very challenged, partly because the solar and wind power is not entirely compatible with the old power grids, because it comes in kind of direct current, which the old power grids have to change into alternating current, and it comes in surges very often. But it's also, I hadn't realized the degree to which AI just absolutely devours electricity, and I hadn't realized that fully. And so that, with the exponential rise of AI, that's going to put great strain on creaking power grids, and the state of the power grids obviously changes from one country to another. But I do think the power grids will be very tested, which will eventually force a shift of the way we use energy and the way we find energy and sources of power. And there may be galactic input to that as well, but I think for sure free energy is going to be a huge jump forwards, and light and sound and living energy systems, which is something Dr. David Clements is talking about. I think the revolution with all of that is really beginning right now. Yeah, it's very exciting.
Yes. I know, and quickly, right? Even think 5 years ago, when I was talking about this, I was always like whispering, like you're not going to get it, or I sound a little bit crazy. But now it's definitely happening quickly.
There used to be, and your last one was Awakening, which of course I love.
And awakening is like a massive shift in consciousness among all of us, moving much more into compassion, love, moving out of denial, moving into a sense that we are all interconnected, this othering that has built up over centuries and millenniums, that we start to really have true compassion for each other. And I think it's even in the conversation as some scientists and very didactic economists, are talking about, like, we have to move out of denial and move into understanding that all of our economies are interconnected, and therefore we are all interconnected. So I think, that kind of consciousness shift. Also just really being less checked out, I think, like an ability to be more checked into what's happening more frequently. I think our experience of time is shifting. And as that happens, our experience of what happens in between the events. So I love the definition of time as, what happens in between events. So as more events happen, then we experience more transformation more quickly, and we can stay, even awake more frequently.
Absolutely. And I think as consciousness rises, there's a greater ability to stay in the now. And when you're in the now, there is no past and no future. And it's really interesting, because I think this sense of oneness that many of us feel, and more people will feel, is the original state of being, isn't it? You know, look back to ancient Lemuria, but even Lynn McTaggart with her work says that the optimal state of, to run a society is collaboration and altruism. It's not competition. It's not dog eats dog. And you know, she's written a beautiful book about that with The Power of Eight. And so when we come together and share, and I think particularly coming out of COVID and the lockdown, there is just a greater heart-based desire to want to give and to share and not want to see any more suffering, any more war, death, poverty, misery. You know, because if you have that greater sense of psychic sensitivity with someone, I can feel how you feel, that greater sense of empathy. It's unbearable to see someone else suffer. You just want to give. And that will bring up, as you say, Rosie, you know, the compassion to a much greater degree. So I think there could be several aspects of your 5 possible futures that could kind of blend together. But I think particularly the last 3, the non-violent demonstrations, the scientific paradigm shift and the awakening, absolutely, you know, I feel personally they're already rolling right now. They're already happening.
Yes, and I think those 3 mitigate the collapse and the violent revolution. Do you know, like focusing on those will make it so, I mean, we have a choice in this together.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And more people are thinking that way and becoming aware that, boy, we could do this way better than we are. You know, we could really, really go beyond the war, the death, the poverty, the misery, the suffering. I've got such a strong sense of we are no longer going to go around the same hamster wheel. We've broken out of the tram tracks, is my very strong feeling. And your research absolutely reinforces that this is the last time for many, many thousands of years that Pluto will go out of bounds. Luckily to the south, not to the north. So this is, you know, which is a much more positive process. And it's just another piece of the puzzle to reinforce what I'm hearing from cosmologists and theoretical physicists and channelers and the astrology. You can see it, you know, it's just beautiful to see. It's all converging. But before we finish, there was another thing in your research that I found absolutely fascinating, was where you've discovered that the point in space, the degree where Pluto goes out of bounds, north or south, is very activated and manifests in certain people in certain ways. So I think 9 degrees of Leo is where Pluto crosses to go out of bounds to the north, and 9 degrees of Aquarius is where it crosses out of bounds to start that process to the south. And that was absolutely fascinating. So would you like to talk about that a little bit and some individuals who exemplify both of those, perhaps?
Yeah, so this takes it to another level. And I started noticing that people in positions of power often had something at 9 degrees Aquarius or 9 degrees Leo. Also studying 9 degrees Taurus, the vision point with visionaries and mystics, and then 9 degrees Scorpio of activists or revolutionaries. And so even looking at our current picture, we have leaders like J.D. Vance has his son at the power place. We have let me pull up my list. Let me pull up my.
In the past, with Leo, you were talking about Henry Ford, Mussolini, Obama. People.
Yeah.
And what orb do you use, Rosie?
I use the same orb as the orb for, sorry, let me just pull up my sheet here. So first, here's just what it is. I use about a 5 degree orb for this. In the past, because Pluto would go out of bounds for longer, I might use a larger orb. But I think the closer it is to 9, the more interesting it is.
Right.
Yeah. So just give me a second here. So then here's a list just of people with the sun at these points. At Reform, Zelensky, his sun is at 5 Aquarius. Carlos Slim Hilo, one of the richest people on the planet. Jerome Powell, who's in charge of the Federal Reserve. Our Chief Justice, John Roberts. Mike Johnson, who's current head of the House right now here. Oprah. And then Sun at Power, we have Vance, we have Michael Martin, who's currently the Prime Minister of Ireland, Ali al-Sistani, the head of the Shia religion. And then at the Scorpio point, we have Bill Gates and Charles Koch, who are, well, we know who they are. So sometimes we have people that are a lot more focused around finances when we see Sun at the Justice. And then the visionaries, we have the current Secretary General of the UN there. And yeah, like past visionaries. So if we just look at past people with this, we've got Da Vinci, Machiavelli, Taylor de Chardin, Kierkegaard, Morse, Marconi, Freud, Otto Rank, Horace Mann. We have like core visionaries, and this is going to be out soon in my workbook. This is going to be in a workbook that I'll put out. But one of the most fascinating pieces about this is the Sun Moon midpoint, which I didn't usually tune into a lot. So this is the point directly in between the sun and the moon that integrates our ability to be an identity and our ability to experience what life throws at us, the moon. And so we see pretty extraordinary list of people with sun moon midpoint at either close to 9 Leo or close to 9 Aquarius. And I think this is one
difference, Rosie, in how that power manifests as well. Leo to Aquarius.
Oh, yes. I mean, we see Putin and Musk both with their sun moon midpoint, and the Dalai Lama, Kevin Roberts. So Putin, Musk, and Kevin Roberts all close to that Leo point. We have Karen Keller-Sutter in Switzerland, and BZ. Sometimes the midpoint, it depends a little bit on how close the sun and moon are, how activated the Leo or the Aquarius, because it's midpoint, right? So they're both active. So I look at these points. The sun moon midpoint, you can see the moon has a pretty interesting list of people. Xi Jinping, Ursula von der Leyen, Donald Tusk. When a planet is there, it seems that they get super activated, like the purpose of the person becomes something that connects into the world. As I've been seeing clients for the last 20 years looking at this point, every time I tell someone, like, I can feel that there's something burning in you that needs to come out, that the world needs. And not everybody has that kind of burning, I have something I have to do here, that kind of accentuates whatever the other purposes that we see through other things in the chart.
Yeah, my North Node is at 10 of Aquarius.
Yeah, so that makes so much sense. Just feeling called to kind of initiate and this reform time.
And in the third house, so it has to be spoken or written. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and that networking of the third house also that you're doing. Yeah.
Wow, it's really fascinating. Because this point, the crossing of Pluto into the outer bounds position is simply a point in space, but it becomes activated. And so that suggests it's something electromagnetic, a little bit like the lunar nodes or the eclipse point.
Yes. I mean, I think if we think about the magnitude of the Kuiper Belt itself, and how much them that they're starting to understand is a toroidal field. It acts like a toroidal field. It has an incline, so not only is Pluto inclined, but Haumea is inclined, Makemake is inclined. So a lot of these Kuiper Belt orbits are inclined in the same direction, or roughly the same direction. So Pluto is marking those points, but it's not the only planet or dwarf planet that's marking those points. And so it is pointing to something that is maybe outside of our purview at this moment in time. It's like an indicator point of, okay, we're in relationship to this Kuiper Belt orb.
And what I think is really fascinating is, as we know with eclipses as well, don't we, Rosie? That eclipse degrees become hot, they become activated, and when another planet crosses by that, even though the eclipse is long gone, there's some kind of reactivation of what was happening at the eclipse. And so, is it that birth charts and our charts of any moment are actually electromagnetic maps?
Absolutely. Yes, because I mean, we all look at our nodes, right? And that's just, that's a point in space. That's like an activation point. Even looking at a sun moon midpoint is an activation point.
Yeah, absolutely. I use that a lot for relationship. It's very powerful in relationship. But the lunar nodes, I mean, I wrote a book about that because they're so mysterious. And isn't it interesting that, they're just at that point at the moment of your birth, and then, of course, repeat every 18.6 years. But the degree to which they have such a massive pull on relationship and allow past life information to leak in is just extraordinary. They're not even a planet. They're just a point in space. But they're very, very powerful. So there's something about the electromagnetism of the astronomy and the astrology that I think we are just at the very beginning of understanding.
Yeah, because you could think that a lot of times I think astrology is dismissed because there isn't a detectable electric force field that the planets are doing to us. But as we understand more physics, more really understand how things work and manifest, even just understanding Maxwell's equations better, understanding what magnetism creates and what these energy fields are, then I think we will understand that, first of all, time is one of the multiple dimensions. And so we are working with resonances all throughout just astrology and all throughout the manifestation of all of this. So where are things in resonance? And that doesn't have to mean that there's exactly a planet at that place, but there can be a field or a remembrance or even a future calling of that place.
Yeah, it's really astonishing. I think we're going to discover so much about our craft going forwards, about the subject that we've worked with for so many years. I think it's going to be massively exciting. So just to summarise what we've covered, because we've covered so much, Rosie, and you've just been astonishing in your depth and breadth of all the research. So firstly, this is the last Pluto out of bounds for many thousands of years, and it's out of bounds to the south, which is power to the people, which is way better than going out of bounds to the north, which is moving back into domination and empires, etc. And it will not happen all year round. It will happen just for a few months at the end of each of the next 10 years and peak around 2030, I think you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
so,
5 years from now.
And so after 2030, do you really sort of see that diminishing? Is there a fading from that point? Because that's only 5 years away.
Yeah. And Pluto's really barely out of bounds to begin with. So yes, it's fading. When I'm looking at charts, I'm thinking we're one society now, but post 2035, we're going to have a vastly different world. So the careers and the things that people are trying to make decisions about past 2035 are going to be in a completely different reality.
Yeah,
so I think this is changing quickly.
I would really agree with you. I think it's changing faster than we can possibly imagine. But the science and the understanding of our reality and the cosmos and how energy and frequency work, I think is just going to go lickety split. And we're going to have amazing new free energy. We're going to have amazing healing devices, much less degeneration and disease. I think it's a whole new world that we're entering, and your amazing research has actually really reinforced that. So it's been so painstaking and so thorough, Rosie. So we really are in a consciousness revolution, aren't we, right now?